The man who controlled the gate. Every major commercial seaport in the United States processes thousands of containers each day. The mathematics of volume are staggering and deliberate. The global commercial supply chain depends on cargo moving at a pace that physical inspection cannot match if applied universally. Federal law requires that 100% of inbound containers be screened through non-intrusive imaging technology before release into U.S. commerce. It does not require that 100% be opened, examined by hand, and cleared by a human officer personally reviewing contents. That distinction between a container that passes through a scanner and a container that is flagged for secondary physical inspection is the operational seam that hostile intelligence services and criminal networks spend significant resources trying to exploit. Exploiting that seam does not require defeating the technology. It requires controlling the human being who decides whether the technology's output triggers a secondary referral. For 4 years and 3 months, a senior terminal operations manager at one of the highest volume commercial seaports on the U.S. eastern seaboard controlled exactly that decision for a specific category of inbound cargo. He did not tamper with scanners. He did not alter imaging data. He did not create false manifests or fraudulent documentation. He did what his job title gave him the authority to do. He classified containers as low risk under the port's internal risk scoring system, which deprioritized them for secondary physical inspection and ensured they moved through the terminal and into domestic freight channels without the physical review that would have revealed what was inside them. In exchange, he received $2.1 million in payments routed through a financial architecture maintained by Chinese intelligence operatives who had recruited him at an academic conference in Singapore 3 years before his first act of facilitation. What moved through the containers he protected was not a single category of contraband. The architecture he provided was used for multiple purposes across the 4-year operational period. Surveillance technology components, subject to U.S. export controls being reverse-engineered and shipped back out through the same corridor, controlled pharmaceutical precursors, and in the final 18 months of the operation, military-grade electronic components whose ultimate destination, traced by federal investigators through a chain of 12 shell companies across 7 countries, was a procurement network servicing programs of concern to U.S. national security. The full scope of what had moved through that seam over 4 years and 3 months took federal investigators 20 months to reconstruct. The investigation that did the reconstructing was one of the most operationally complex domestic port security cases ever assembled by a joint federal task force. Drawing on HSY, CBP, the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, Commerce Department Export Enforcement, and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, coordinating across 3 federal districts and 2 allied partner intelligence services. This is ATF Trigger, and this is how it started. Not at the port, not with a suspicious container, but with a number that did not belong in a routine shipping database query. Part 1. The anomaly in the risk scores. The Federal Customs risk scoring system that governs container inspection priority is a sophisticated analytical tool built on years of enforcement data, cargo profiling, and behavioral modeling. It is not perfect. No system of this complexity is, but its outputs are statistically predictable within known ranges. Containers from specific origin points, through specific shipping channels, carrying specific categories of goods, receive risk scores that cluster within ranges that experienced analysts can predict based on historical data. A Homeland Security Investigations data analyst assigned to a routine compliance review project was running a statistical audit of risk score distributions at 6 major U.S. seaports when she noticed something that did not fit the expected distribution at one of them. The anomaly was not dramatic. It was subtle enough that a less careful analyst or a review with less statistical depth might have attributed it to normal variation and moved on. A specific subcategory of inbound containers, those arriving through a set of shipping lines serving routes through certain Southeast and East Asian transshipment hubs, showed a pattern of risk score assignments at the port in question that deviated from the statistical distribution at comparable ports, processing similar cargo through similar routes. The deviation was in one direction only. The scores at this port, for this container category, were systematically lower than they should have been based on the comparative data. Lower scores meant fewer secondary inspection referrals. Fewer secondary inspection referrals meant more containers moving through without physical review. The analyst flagged the deviation in her audit report as a statistical anomaly warranting further review. The report was forwarded through standard channels, reached a supervisor with sufficient operational background to recognize what the pattern could indicate, and triggered a referral to HSI's Port Security Division within 10 days of the initial flag. The HSI review team that took the referral spent 6 weeks developing it, before concluding that the statistical pattern was not explicable through any combination of legitimate operational factors. Staffing differences, equipment variance, cargo composition shifts, policy interpretation differences between ports. The pattern was too consistent, too directional, and too specifically concentrated in the container category, where it appeared to have an innocent explanation. The review team elevated the matter to a formal investigation, and because the pattern suggested the possibility of an insider with authority over risk score assignments, the investigation was opened under strict counterintelligence protocols from the first day, compartmentalized from port security staff, coordinated through HSY's internal affairs channel, and structured to ensure that no element of the investigation touched any individual at the port who had not been cleared as outside the potential pool of insider subjects. The pool of individuals with the specific system access and operational authority to influence risk score assignments for the container category, showing the anomalous distribution, was small. 6 people total, across 2 operational shifts. Within 4 weeks of the formal investigation opening, the pool had narrowed to 1. Part 2. 4 years of trusted access. The senior terminal operations manager had come to his position through 16 years of port logistics work. A career that had moved progressively through operational roles at 2 different ports before his hiring at the current facility. His professional record was clean. His security clearance required for his level of system access had been issued and renewed without incident. His performance reviews were consistently strong. He was, by every documented professional metric, exactly the kind of experienced, trusted senior operator that a high-volume commercial port needed in a management role overseeing the systems that kept thousands of containers moving efficiently through the terminal each day. He was also, by the time federal investigators had reconstructed the timeline, 3 years into a relationship with a Chinese intelligence service that had identified him, cultivated him, and recruited him with a patience and sophistication that the counterintelligence analysts reviewing the case would later describe as a textbook example of professional intelligence tradecraft applied to a non-traditional target environment. The cultivation had begun at an international port logistics conference in Singapore, where the manager had presented a panel session on operational efficiency systems in high-volume commercial terminals. The individual who had initiated contact with him at the conference, engaging him after his panel in a detailed professional conversation about the technical systems he had described, was later identified by federal investigators as a Chinese intelligence officer operating under commercial cover as a shipping industry consultant. The relationship had developed over 2 years through a combination of professional correspondence, 2 additional conference encounters, and a consulting arrangement through which the manager had provided what he understood to be legitimate industry expertise to what appeared to be a legitimate commercial research operation. The compensation for the consulting work, modest at first, structured to appear entirely routine, had gradually been supplemented by additional payments that were framed as performance bonuses and research premiums. By the time the first operational request arrived, a request to ensure that a specific container, identified by its booking number, received a low-priority risk score classification. The relationship had been carefully constructed to make the request feel like a natural extension of a trusted professional arrangement, rather than the intelligence service recruitment operation it actually was. The framing was commercial, a client with time-sensitive cargo who needed to ensure smooth clearance. The compensation was $40,000, transferred through an intermediary account in a third country. The manager complied. The container cleared without secondary inspection. Over the following 4 years and 3 months, the operational requests had continued on a cadence of approximately every 3 to 4 weeks. Each request identified a specific container or small group of containers. Each identified cargo was classified low priority by the manager using his legitimate system access. Each cleared without physical review. The total number of containers that investigators ultimately documented as having been facilitated through the corridor was 218 over the 4-year period. The total value of the payments received for that facilitation was $2.1 million, distributed across a financial architecture that used 11 accounts in 6 countries to create sufficient distance between the intelligence service's payment infrastructure and the manager's accessible funds. What moved through those 218 containers spanned a range of contraband categories that reflected the intelligence service's evolving operational priorities over the 4-year period. In the early phase, the corridor had been used primarily for technology components, electronics, and materials subject to U.S. export controls that had been acquired through front companies in the United States and were being shipped back to the source country for analysis, with the return shipment used as cover for the outbound movement. In the middle period, the corridor had been used for controlled pharmaceutical precursors. In the final 18 months, the operational focus had shifted to military-adjacent electronics, components with dual-use potential, sourced through the domestic supply chain, destined for a procurement network that federal investigators traced through the 12-company chain to programs of national security concern. The final shipment in the documented series, the one that was in transit when the investigation closed, contained advanced integrated circuit components on the Commerce Department's restricted list, 17 containers worth, moving through the port under low-priority risk classifications, assigned by a manager who had been doing exactly this for 4 years. The investigation intercepted them before they cleared the terminal. Part 3. 20 months and the architecture of the corridor. The 20-month investigation that fully mapped the operation before executing arrests was structured around 3 parallel investigative threads that gradually merged into a single unified evidentiary picture. The first thread was the financial investigation. Working from the manager's documented compensation and building outward through court-authorized financial account review, forensic accountants assigned to the task force spent the first 8 months of the investigation tracing the payment architecture backward from the manager's accessible accounts through the intermediary chain. The 11 accounts in 6 countries had been designed to make each individual transaction appear legitimate and to prevent any single account from showing a payment pattern that would suggest intelligence compensation. But forensic accounting works across the full architecture rather than account by account, and the complete picture that emerged from 18 months of financial reconstruction was unambiguous. $2.1 million in structured payments, timed consistently with the operational request cycle, moving through a financial infrastructure maintained by entities whose ultimate ownership connections led to organizations with documented ties to Chinese state-linked operations. The second thread was the cargo reconstruction. Customs records, shipping manifests, port entry documentation, and secondary source data from allied partner intelligence services were used to reconstruct the cargo history of the 218 containers that the financial investigation had flagged as operationally connected. The reconstruction process identified what each container had officially carried, documented the risk score classification each had received, confirmed that each had moved through without secondary inspection, and, in a subset of cases where downstream tracking data was available, traced the movement of the cargo after it left the port. That downstream tracing produced the most operationally significant intelligence of the entire investigation. The 12-company chain connecting the final phase of the corridor's use to the military-adjacent procurement network. Each company in the chain had been established in a different jurisdiction, operated for a limited period, and dissolved or rendered dormant after serving its logistical function. The chain had been built to withstand any single company investigation, to ensure that pulling any one thread would not reveal the full connection. Building the complete 12-link picture required the coordinated effort of the task force's domestic investigative resources and the intelligence contributions of 2 allied partner services working in jurisdictions where several of the intermediate entities had been incorporated. The third thread was the technical forensic work on the port's internal systems, working through the formal legal process for accessing the port's operational records, a process that required careful navigation of the port's operating agreements and the legal frameworks governing federal access to commercial infrastructure. The task force built a complete audit history of the manager's system activity over the 4-year period. Every risk score assignment he had made, every container he had classified, every access event in the system tied to his credentials. That audit record, cross-referenced against the financial investigation's payment timeline and the cargo reconstruction's container identification, produced a documented correlation that connected 218 specific containers to 218 specific low-priority risk score assignments to 218 specific points in the payment timeline. The correlation was not statistical inference. It was a documented operational record, container by container, payment by payment, assignment by assignment, covering 4 years and 3 months of sustained insider facilitation. By month 18 of the investigation, the task force had a case that federal prosecutors described as among the most thoroughly documented port security corruption matters they had encountered. By month 19, the 17 containers carrying restricted integrated circuit components were 3 weeks from arriving at the port. The task force made a decision. Let them arrive. Document the risk score assignment. And then, before a single container cleared the terminal, execute. Part 4. The morning the corridor closed. The 17 containers arrived at the port on a Tuesday morning, processed through standard inbound documentation procedures, entered the terminal's risk scoring queue, and, at 9:17 a.m., as federal surveillance teams watched from positions inside and outside the Terminal Operations Center, received low-priority risk score classifications assigned by the manager using his standard system credentials. His final act of facilitation, recorded in the port's audit system with a timestamp that would appear in federal charging documents, was the same as his first 4 years and 3 months earlier. A few keystrokes, a classification entered, a container queue updated, routine, invisible, consequential. At 9:34 a.m., federal agents entered the Terminal Operations Center. The manager was taken into custody at his workstation without incident. Federal agents simultaneously executed search warrants at his residence and at a secondary location, a commercial property connected to one of the intermediary entities in the payment chain that had been identified through the financial investigation. Digital forensic teams began their review immediately at all 3 locations. The 17 containers were pulled from the clearance queue before any of them left the terminal. Physical inspection teams opened each one. The restricted integrated circuit components were inside, packaged in commercial electronics shipment materials, manifested as consumer-grade equipment. All 17 containers were seized as evidence. Simultaneously, federal agents executed arrest and search warrants at 4 additional locations connected to the domestic procurement network that had been using the corridor in its final phase. 3 individuals involved in the acquisition and shipment of the restricted components were taken into custody. A 4th individual had departed the country 48 hours before the operation. A departure that the task force had monitored but had determined did not indicate awareness of the impending arrest, based on travel patterns that predated the investigation's final phase. The coordinated actions in allied partner jurisdictions, covering 2 of the intermediate entities in the 12-company chain, were executed through the partner services on the same morning, timed to coincide with the domestic arrests to prevent any network communication that might allow participants in other jurisdictions to destroy evidence or flee. The evidence inventory compiled over the following weeks documented the full scope of what had been built and what had moved through it. 218 containers facilitated through the corridor over 4 years and 3 months. 17 containers carrying restricted integrated circuit components intercepted before clearing the terminal. $2.1 million in documented payments across 11 accounts in 6 countries. The 12-company procurement chain connecting the corridor's final operational phase to the national security relevant program, fully documented through the domestic and partner jurisdiction investigative work. 4 individuals arrested in domestic operations. 2 additional individuals detained by partner country authorities in connected jurisdictions. The manager faced federal charges including acting as an agent of a foreign government without registration, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and violations of the Export Administration regulations, covering the restricted components identified in the final shipment series. The charging document ran to 41 pages, covering the full 4-year operational history documented by the investigation. The 17 containers sat in federal custody on the terminal dock, unopened for commerce, as evidence of the operation that had used the seam between scanner output and human decision for 4 years, and found it closed on a Tuesday morning at 9:34 a.m. Part 5. The seam in the system. What the investigation documented was not primarily a story about a corrupt individual. It was a story about a structural vulnerability in commercial port security that a hostile intelligence service had identified, mapped, and exploited with precision. The technology works. Imaging systems, non-intrusive inspection equipment, radiation portals. The physical screening infrastructure at U.S. Seaport represents a genuine security capability. What it cannot do is make enforcement decisions. The decision of whether scanner output triggers secondary physical review requires human judgment in a risk prioritization system. And risk prioritization, by nature, produces a low priority category. Cargo that moves faster, with less scrutiny, because the volume cannot move otherwise. The manager had not defeated the technology. He had operated within legitimate parameters, using his authorized access in his authorized role, in a way that systematically protected the cargo his handlers needed cleared. The containers received risk scores. The scores were within the accepted range. The system recorded everything correctly. The only thing it did not record was why. Finding the why required the statistical analysis the HSI data analyst had performed. Looking at aggregate distribution across a population large enough to reveal what no individual transaction showed. It required the patience to build a 20-month investigation rather than act on the first indicator. It required forensic accounting to trace $2.1 million through 11 accounts in 6 countries. And it required allied partner intelligence cooperation in jurisdictions unreachable through domestic legal process alone. The statistical anomaly that flagged the operation was not a dramatic alert. It was a number, a deviation in a risk score distribution, that a careful analyst noticed and chose to document rather than attribute to normal variation. ATF Trigger covers these cases because commercial infrastructure security is only as strong as the human decisions made inside it. When that integrity is compromised, the breach looks like routine until a data analyst notices a number that doesn't fit. That number started the investigation. 20 months of work built the case that closed it. The 17 containers never cleared the terminal. The corridor that moved 218 of them over 4 years did not survive the morning of the arrest. All information presented in this production is drawn from fictional dramatization of federal law enforcement and counterintelligence concepts. No real cases, real individuals, or specific operations are depicted. ATF Trigger produces content for educational and informational purposes related to federal law enforcement procedures and capabilities. This production does not represent official communications from any federal agency